Welcome to the Workbench and welcome to another episode of Wheels Wings TV. 2022 marks the 40th anniversary of the Falklands War, or, as it is also known, La Guerra de las Malvinas. Although the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines claim the lion's share of the credit for the British victory, it was Operation Blackbuck that made that victory possible. XM-607, a 30-year-old RAF bomber, having flown over 6,000 kilometers, landed a single 1,000-pound bomb out of its load of 21 right in the middle of the only runway that could support fast attack jets that could have been used to threaten the Royal Navy Task Force and ensure the Argentine hold on the island. Originally designed to deliver nuclear annihilation to the Soviet Union and appropriately named for the Roman god of fire, the Vulcan, only weeks away from retirement, had finally lived up to its reputation as a chariot of fire. It was also around this time that Airfix released their first kit of the Vulcan, and 40 years later, they have given us a new and improved kit of this iconic delta-winged aircraft. Let's have a look. As is standard operating procedure with aircraft, we start with the cockpit. The Vulcan's cockpit has two levels, with the pilot's positions on the upper level and the navigation and electronics officers behind and below. I strongly encourage you to spend as little time in the cockpit as is necessary because, spoiler alert, pretty much none of it will be seen on the finished model. Very small windows combined with a completely black interior mean any extra effort in detailing this area is a complete waste of time. It doesn't mean squat if you know it's in there because no one else will. That being said, at the time I did paint up the pilot's ejection seats, as these are the only things breaking up the black interior with their khaki belts and yellow cushions. The instrument panel and side consoles are taken care of with very high contrast decals and are more than enough for this model. While you're at it, don't forget to add a substantial amount of nose weight. Airfix suggests 40 grams, but it wouldn't hurt to err on the side of caution and add just a little bit more. Up next is the bomb bay and its very robust supporting framework. To this is added spars to support the wings. Then, the entire assembly is glued into the lower wing halves. For a little insurance, I reinforced the joins with sprue goo to make sure everything was solidly welded together. It is at this point that the sheer size of this model becomes readily apparent, with the real aircraft measuring 30 meters or 100 feet from wingtip to wingtip and nose to tail. For reference, my workbench is 45 centimeters or 18 inches deep, which doesn't leave a lot of room to swing this thing around. One improvement to make in the bomb bay is opening up all of the lightning holes in the cross members. These won't be immediately noticeable once the bombs are fitted, but I would strongly encourage this modification if you plan on leaving the bomb bay empty. Next are the main undercarriage bays, which are provided in flat pack style, and once the four sides and the roof are assembled, can be installed in the lower wing. The nose wheel bay on my example wasn't a perfect fit and required a small shim along the rear bulkhead. Yours might not need this, such is the consistent inconsistency we sometimes get from Airfix. So far, the build has been rather typical in construction and parts breakdown. However, coming to the intakes, I really wish Airfix could have brought some innovation to this area. The intakes are split top and bottom, with the leading edge of the center partition molded separately. I really feel that these could have, if not should have, been slide molded. Seamless intakes would have been a very effective selling point for this kit. Perhaps somebody on the aftermarket will release some one-piece resin intakes, hopefully molded in white. As it is, the intakes require a fair amount of filling and sanding to remove the seam lines, as the gloss white paint job needed is not going to hide any mistakes. The alternative option would be to fit the FOD covers. However, this must be done when the two halves come together, as it cannot be popped in from the front later. Filling was done with medium superglue, and various grades of sandpaper wrapped around some plastic tubing was required to eliminate the seams. Although, try as I might, evidence of this work is still somewhat noticeable. So, with the intakes mostly presentable, they were painted with Mr. Color off-white. By itself, this color is quite obviously, well, off-white. But once it is contrasted against the other camouflage colors, this difference is hardly noticeable. The turbine faces were painted silver, and once dry, were washed with Citadel Nuln oil before gluing them in place at the back of the intakes. Leaving the intakes alone for a bit, we now join the two upper wing halves, and here we have another place where I feel Airfix dropped the ball with their engineering. The two wings are connected with overlapping tabs, and because of this need to be joined together first before they can be dropped into the lower wing. Additionally, the inner face of the wings serves as the roof of the bomb bay, a roof that now has an obvious seam down the middle interspersed with tabs that stand proud of the surrounding detail. No, most of this will not be readily noticeable on the finished model, but this feels very kludged together. Having a separate bomb bay roof joining the two wings would offer much stronger assembly, as well as removing the unsightly seams. Or perhaps they could have split the upper wing into 3 sections as they did on their original kit. The 1983 kit had the outer wings separate from the inner section on both top and bottom, and is rather notorious for being quite fiddly to fit securely and have everything line up. I feel like 40 years later they could have pulled off that level of engineering, as not only would this allow for having the bomb bay roof and upper fuselage as a single piece, also allow for alternate wings to model the early B1 variant of the Vulcan with its perfectly straight leading edges. With the wings together, we can attach the nose section. This isn't a perfect fit, but the seam is along a panel line, so it won't be overly noticeable with just a bit of Mr. Surfacer 500 on the more offending areas. Not being entirely happy with the kit refueling probe, and not wanting to repeat what happened to one Black Buck Vulcan after the probe broke off and it had to divert to Brazil, I decided to cut it off and replace it with a length of brass tubing, not only so that it would be stronger, but so it could be painted separately and added at the end of the build. It's always best to leave sticky outie bits off as long as you can. This new refueling probe will be completed with a Master turned aluminum tip. Master does offer a complete turned brass probe for the Vulcan, however, using the separate aluminum tips means we don't need to paint it. With the nose in place, we can now attach the intake splitter plates. On my kit, these were a very loose fit and required a 10 thou plastic shim on the backside for them to fit snugly. While we're at it, the wingtips are molded with the upper wing halves and are noticeably thinner than the adjoining lower wing, and required a liberal application of putty and subsequent sanding to level them with the lower wing. With regards to the vertical tail, as we are doing XM607, we will need to use the top piece with the square profile and not the sloped one as called out for the instructions. For ordnance, the kit provides either the blue steel nuclear missile or, appropriately for XM607, 21 1,000-pound conventional high explosive bonds, which Airfix have decided to mold intricately with the vague interpretation of their mounting hardpoints. This greatly simplifies construction. However, if you wanted to depict 607 after it had returned from the Falklands, you would have to fabricate the empty bomb racks. Now, the wheels provided in the kit are perfectly usable. However, I prefer the added tire tread and brake detail offered by these resin replacements from Armoury Models. Using a machinist square, the wheels are squared up and glued into pairs. The wheels are painted with Tamiya rubber black, then masked off with the provided pre-cut masks, and the hubs painted with Mr. Color gun chrome. With the airframe together and all the lesser components finished, we are just about ready to start painting proper. First though, the areas in front and behind the cockpit were brush painted with Citadel Abaddon black before gluing the cockpit canopy in place and saying so long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, goodbye to the cockpit. The windshield panels are a bit tricky to mask due to the windshield wipers being molded in place. So just make sure to burnish the tape down very well, and as always have a new blade in your favorite knife or scalpel. Now it's prime time. We will of course be using my favorite Vallejo Mecha Primer in black. This is thinned down and mixed with a little bit of flow improver, giving us a smooth, semi-gloss finish once dry. Although touch dry after a few minutes, I suggest leaving the model alone until the next day to make sure the primer is dry all the way through. Now that the primer is dry, we have our airbrush loaded up with some more Mr. Color Off-White, and we are going to pre-shade the entire upper surface of the model. This was done over a few sessions, and my wrist is hurting just talking about it. This might seem like a lot of work for little payoff, but this is going to help break up the great swaths of gray and green camo with a little bit of subtle variation. Now you notice I said we will pre-shade the entire upper surface. Well, what about the bottom? We're going to do the bottom slightly differently. We will start with the same marbling pattern, however we are going to use the Mr. Color Dark Sea Gray that will be the final color instead of white. This is for two reasons. One, the underside of XM607 was repainted this color before deploying to the South Atlantic, so it would not be as worn as the upper surface. And two, the bottom is going to be barely visible on the finished model, so instead of investing all that time here, we can better spend it elsewhere. With the bottom done, we can flip the thing over and start on the upper wings. We will first outline the gray areas before methodically filling them in with Mr. Color Medium Sea Gray. Exact shapes aren't too important here, as we will more precisely define the pattern with tape before moving on. Speaking of tape, we will initially lay down the perimeter of the gray with thin, flexible tape, and once we have the entire wing mapped out, we can start to fill in these areas with regular masking tape. And just like that, we're done. Wasn't that easy? Now we can block in the dark green. And once we're done with the green, we can start peeling up all that masking tape, as always, making sure to do it in the most satisfying way possible. Now, one part of masking I skipped over is the intakes. The camouflage partially extends into the intakes, and this was an absolute pain in the butt to mask off. Airfix do provide some paper templates in the instructions, but I didn't find these were really of much help. I wasn't able to record this process, but needless to say, this was probably the most difficult part of the build. Or, the easy way to go about it would be to just do one of the overall gloss white Vulcans and not have to worry about it. Flipping the model back over, we mask off around the undercarriage bays and the bomb bay and paint these areas with more Mr. Color Off-White. With all the main colors down, we can now start on the markings. The Black Buck Vulcans all sported the low-vis blue and red roundels and fin flashes. The kit only provides the high-vis red, white, and blue roundels. So, as we have done in previous builds, we will be masking and painting these markings. Using the kit decals as a guide, we cut out some appropriately sized masks and first paint the blue outer ring. Next, we carefully position the second mask inside the first and spray the red areas. The various stencils we can get from the kit decal sheet. However, that still leaves the serial number. For this, we located an appropriate RAF font online and printed out our own. These were cut out and applied just like any other decal. Although I think I was a bit heavy-handed sealing them onto the paper, as they ended up being a bit thicker than I expected. With the decals down, we can proceed to accent the panel lines with some ammo deep gray panel line wash. Now we can get on with final assembly. One thing I suggest is once the wheels are glued onto the undercarriage legs, carefully level the bottoms of them with a rigid sanding block to ensure that all the wheels will be contacting the ground. This is a good idea if you use the kit supplied wheels, as this will give the impression of weight on the wheels. This aircraft could weigh up to 170,000 pounds fully loaded after all. One feature specific to XM607 was the jerry-rigged hardpoint for the AN/ALQ 101-10 ECM pod under the starboard wing. The Vulcan's onboard jamming equipment was old and was tuned to Soviet radar frequencies and was deemed not to be effective against the British and American modern radars in use by the Argentine forces. So these more capable jamming pods were borrowed from the Buccaneer fleet. The Dash 10 and its mount are not provided in the kit and are not yet available on the aftermarket. So these examples were scratch-built by yours truly. I'd like to see an in-depth how-to on making these pieces for your Vulcan. Leave me a comment as such below. The final part to attach is that turned aluminum refueling probe, and our Vulcan is finished. So, the not-so-small 1/72nd Vulcan from Airfix. Generally speaking, this is a decent kit, and I would rank it one of the better recent offerings from Airfix. My example was free from excess flash and mismolded parts. However, there were some not unnoticeable sink marks and some variation in the fidelity of the panel lines. I am curious as to why Airfix did not offer more exotic schemes in this initial release. For those living in the UK while it was in service, I would imagine the standard RAF schemes would be more familiar. However, for the rest of the world, most probably recognize the Vulcan either from the Falklands War or the James Bond movie, Thunderball. Be that as it may, Airfix can once again claim that they have the best 1/72nd scale kit of the Vulcan. Perhaps more than any fit issues or filling, just manhandling this thing around your workspace is a chore. So be prepared to touch up the paint or even repair the wingtips, nose, and the tip of the tail, as you will definitely smack these off of anything close by. If you feel like taking on one of these behemoths, you can pick one up in-store or online, link down below. If you'd like to see more content like this, make sure to click like and subscribe. Thanks very much, and we'll catch you next time.